So you're very welcome, and I hope that we are able to, through these lecture series, create a space for debate, for discussions around these issues that still face us today, by using examples from the past, by understanding the lessons of the past, as well as coming to know what we've got right and when we've got them right, and what we could adapt to our current condition. I mean, obviously not everything would be useful from the past, but finding things that are useful is really important. I think we often tend to think that we need to keep on reinventing the wheel, that no one has gone through this before, that it's a new struggle or a new issue. And if we look to the past, I often find that this has happened before, and these struggles have been fought before and won in some cases. So what are the things we can do to actually replicate that in some way in the present? Like Comrade Yvonne said, I mean, one of the reasons we are having this is, yes, we've had a lot of advancement in society, especially in South Africa, but at the same time, we still have issues that we face as women in society, as people with LGBTQIA+ identities. So we have to continue the struggle, and we have to take on the struggle. We can't be complacent around it. I think, you know, even one issue around movement, which the 1956 campaign was about the past and the limitation of women's movements. While that was an overt act to limit women's movement, today as women, we are limited in our movement. There might not be a law that says you can't go where you want to, or that you are limited from one place to another. But in a different way, the way our society is structured today, the ways in which women experience violence, the ways in which crime is so high and affects women, we can't do things, we can't move, we can't go to places we want to go freely, and that affects our movement. So those are issues we can speak to and think about still. Yes, in terms of legislation, we've won the right to be anywhere, but actually in terms of how society is structured through economic and social conditions, we find that we can't actually be anywhere and everywhere as we would like. So there's various things that we spoke about yesterday, and one of them I think is this idea about what it is do we do now. How do we build a platform around this work, around remaking, rethinking feminist movement, women's issues that affect women, LGBTQI+ communities. And you know, in the past there's been various types of things that have stopped this from happening or limit how it happens. And today one of the things we want to speak to is about racism in feminism. We will talk about the class question in feminism tomorrow, and then we talk about the ways in which working class women are treated and labor issues on Friday. So there's different ways. And one of the key things that we need to speak to about feminism, and something that's often thrown at us is in South Africa, is that, oh, feminism is a Western concept, that it's not an African concept, which we know is nonsense, right? And part of the work of yesterday was to demonstrate that actually there's a long history of women fighting for their rights in South Africa that's actually more advanced than anything that's been done in the United States or in the UK, for example, and so on. So those are some of the things I think we can speak to. But one of the things that has been consistent in this idea of women in the global South taking their lead from women in the global North is around this idea that we are in deficit. And that idea is based on racist notions of people in the global South. So I want to start today's talk by firstly beginning to speak to what is this question of racism, right? And then we're going to speak to what types of feminism there are, because there are various types of feminisms, and we need to think through what it is that we would like to attach ourselves to and why in this context today. So, you know, racism is discrimination and prejudice towards people based on their race. That's the most basic sort of understanding of what racism is. It's also the belief that humans can be divided based on the superiority of one race over another. Now, that's the basic meaning. But racism itself begins at a particular point in history. It begins at a particular point, and it also transforms itself and evolves itself over time. And we don't often think about that. We just seem to think of it as this one static thing. And I think it's very important to trace that and understand it. Because if something begins, then it has to have an end. So it makes that fight so much easier for us because you are able to say, oh, well, it began at this time, you can end it at this time. It's not something that's innately in the human condition, which is what we've been taught to believe. And that is a highly depoliticizing, not liberatory discourse that makes us, okay, well, it's always been there, what are we going to do? And people say, oh, people have always been competitive. I mean, I, for one, don't believe that. I believe that it comes into being at particular times, because there are many examples in history of people working together to survive, to create community. And it's not always about competition. So the same thing with racism. And racism, everyone can agree upon, is a European concept. And also, it begins in a particular point. Most scholars date it to somewhere in the 1600s, when the notion of racism comes into being. But initially, it's about differentiating yourselves from like kinship, from different groups of people where you lived in Europe. So for example, the English differentiating themselves from the Scottish and the Irish. That was how racism was initially used. But by the 1700s, as the modern nation state gets made in places like France and in England and so on, what you find happening is with the formation of national boundaries, this question of race changes and evolves. And it further changes and evolves with the whole imperial and colonial project, which basically turns it into, from a social sort of category, into a sort of very much a systematic system that is used to oppress and exploit people. And at the heart of this oppression and exploitation, from the very early days of colonialism and imperialism, the people that have been most dispossessed and most oppressed within that story have been black women and brown women in colonized societies. And so it's very important that we understand the structure of racism and the hierarchies within racism as well. And just as how racism has evolved and changed, with feminism, what you have is a sort of, there's various different types of feminism, and we're not going to go into it in detail because this is not a detailed course on different types of feminism. That will take probably a whole year to do. But just very quickly, there's different types of feminism, and they employ different tactics and methods and have different ways in which they see the struggle of women and what they think should be the mechanism of that struggle. And also, this is like the main sort of groupings, but inside that there'll also be further more and more different groupings and sects. As in anything, that's a big idea or an ideology or theory. So one of the key sort of main dominating ideas of feminism for the last 100 years coming out of the global north has been this notion of liberal feminism, which uses the law, which uses sort of policy to affect change in society. It doesn't look at the big structure that needs to be changed. It doesn't look at questions of race, class, all of those things that further divide women even amongst themselves. And so it's often been a sort of feminism that has come under criticism. And within this liberal feminism, you have what comes to be a sort of middle-class bourgeois feminism, which is often dominated by white women in spaces like the academy, in NGOs, and so on. And then you have things like radical feminism, black radical feminism, Marxist socialist feminism, and intersectional feminism. And interestingly enough, black radical feminism, Marxist socialist feminism, has often been very intersectional in its thinking, because it's taken race, class, and gender into account when it's thinking about society, and understanding that these are all linked in the system of oppression onto society. However, intersectional feminism becomes very popular towards the late 80s and 90s. It's a term developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it's dealing mainly with the legalistic side of it. And she finds that the law, even though it states all women are equal, does not cater for the intersectional differences that women have. And therefore, it disadvantages some women, and some women are discriminated against. So that becomes really a popular way of thinking about feminism, and it's very much now a sort of way for us to think about it. In terms of psychoanalytical feminism and postmodern feminism, it's much more around the self, around the identities. Psychoanalytical feminism definitely tends to think that men are different. deep psychologically from women. And there's a set of conditions that do this. Postmodern feminism is much more about, well, there's this idea of us having a performativeness to break down gendered identities and so on. Someone like Judith Butler, who's a famous sort of feminist, is one of the biggest sort of, what's the word? Espouser of this sort of feminism. My English just escapes me every now and then. And then, you know, very interestingly is this men's feminism thing, which is very contested, because on one hand it's like tracing the history of men who have been in solidarity with women in very real ways around women's struggles, and that's usually around the sort of, what you call it, this like men's leagues. But then there's also the one that says, well, men also face all these discriminations. And we know this all too well, because every time we try to speak to issues of feminism and women and what they're going through, you always have men who put their hands up and tell us what their great suffering has been as well on Earth. So we have these kinds of main ideas around feminism, and in the question time we can go into it a bit more. But as this evolution and change in feminism is tied very closely to the story of imperialism and colonialism. And like I said, it was definitely something that was born out of the experiences of black and brown women in the global south and around issues of this racial hierarchy and how to overturn this. And you know, what is really interesting is this doesn't mean that everything is in reaction to the feminism that's developed in the global north. No, there's also feminisms and ideas around women's rights that are developed right here, like we discussed yesterday. That also takes its own context into account. And it's the same that happens in places like India, Latin America, and so on. And what is really important, I think, is for us to realize that imperialism and colonialism create a hierarchical world. And in that hierarchical world, black and brown women get stereotyped in very particular ways. And the stereotyping of them is not done because it's just fun or nice or a joke or something there. It's actually, the stereotyping is actually done because it has very real economic and social consequences for the lives of those women. And it has very real consequences in how imperialists and colonizers can actually exploit them. So it's not something that's airy-fairy and just cultural and doesn't affect them in their real life. And you know, even if you think about this, what's interesting for me and what I often find irritates me as well is the ways in which we often, as women, then take on those stereotypes that were given to us by the colonizers. There's always, I mean, if you think about black men and how they're hypersexualized by colonialism, and then you take that on and think, oh yeah, I'm a black man, I'm great at sex. You know, that comes out of a colonial notion to other you, right? Or the orientalized Indian woman, exotic Indian woman, or something like that. That also, you take that on, but it comes out of a colonizing moment that was used to oppress you. And the person, there are 2 points that I'd like to speak to here that I think really articulate what this does. And bell hooks, obviously, who I return to all the time. I mean, if something's not broke, you don't have to fix it. I don't need newer people. Bell hooks, I'm happy with my bell hooks. She writes, among those groups of women murdered as witches in colonial American society, black females have been historically perceived as embodying a dangerous female nature that must be controlled. More so than any group of women in this society, black women have been seen as all body, no mind. The use of black female bodies in slavery as incubators for the breathing of other slaves was the practical exemplification of the notion that disorderly women should be controlled. To justify white male sexual exploitation and rape of black females during slavery, white culture had to produce an iconography of black female bodies that insisted on representing them as highly sexed, the perfect embodiment of primitive, unbridled eroticism. Such representations impressed on everyone's consciousness the notion that black women were all body and no mind. Once again, all body and no mind. Their cultural currency continues to inform how black females are perceived, seen as sexual sign. Black female bodies are placed in a category that, culturally speaking, is deemed far removed from the life of the mind within the sex, race, class hierarchies of the United States. Black women have always resided at the bottom. Lowly status is reserved in this culture for those deemed incapable of social mobility because they are perceived in a sexist, racist, and classist terms as deficient, inadequate, and inferior. And this is a very long way of showing you what you all know all the time, of actually talking to and describing what many people not only see, but experience themselves all the time. I mean, the minute, I remember when the student movement was happening, the minute a young African woman stands up to speak, it's, oh my God, irrational. Oh my God, they're so hysterical. Oh my God, it can't be an intellectual argument that you are making. This immediately comes to the fore. It's seen in the ways in which women rise to power in our society. They always have to be attached to a man. It can't be that these women actually have the ability to do it because they're supposed to be empty vessels. They are not supposed to think. And you think about this continuously. To a large extent, the African continent is seen as a continent that is deficit of intellectual work. It can't do the intellectual work. And we take that on as well. We take it on and we'll say, oh yeah, obviously we can't do the intellectual work of ruling ourselves. We need to get the IMF and the World Bank and some expert who went to Oxford, who actually doesn't live here, doesn't know anything about our context, to come and tell us what to do. Because we are empty vessels. We can't think, we can't innovate to ourselves. And this starts with this notion. Even if you watch popular TV, there's always the character of the angry black woman. Whether it's a joke or whether it's something, she'll always come in shouting and doing this with herself and screaming. She can never be a rational being. She's the figure of a joke. If you think about the mammies in the early films of Hollywood, also a figure of jokes. You cannot be seen as a serious woman. And if you are, then you have this raw, unbridled sexuality, so like a Tina Turner figure or something like that, to be admired. So there's no thinking that's attributed to the black woman, to the African woman. And as a result of that, you are kept economically and socially oppressed and exploited. And even in the feminist movement, there's this idea that you can't innovate and think for yourself. And therefore you need to be told what to do. You are backward. And that's not only true about African women. Partha Chatterjee, who's of the subaltern studies in India, he writes here about Indian women. And a very similar thing happens with Indian women, but it's around their sexuality. They say, morality and prostitution were central narratives of both colonial intervention and the control of Indian women. By projecting immorality and prostitution onto women, Britain could not only portray imperialism as a moralizing mission, but further its control over women. And this is absolutely important. These are classic examples of how racism is working to oppress and exploit women. And this was done so you could say, well, you know, Indian women are very immoral, we have to protect them, we have to institute all of these really backward laws to control them and to control their bodies. Because, you know, God knows they're just going to attack our men at the drop of a hat. So this happens. It also happens not just through policy and state. It happens culturally, right? I mean, we know this. The sort of image of the mammy that comes out of slavery. There's this very famous Hollywood film called Gone with the Wind that everyone talks about. Is so romantic and lovely, but leaves out the absolute racism of the film towards black people and black women, where there's this character exactly who's portrayed in this manner. If we think about our own history, we think about the way Sarah Baartman was othered. Becomes the template for science to then get involved, pseudoscience to then get involved and make claims about the African woman's body being othered. And the minute you are othered, it means you are not of human. And the minute you are not of the human, we can do anything to you. We can make you a slave. We can make you work in this way. You are not human. You don't have the same feelings of a human. So this is a very, very clear tactic of what happens. And you know, these are the ways in which it's done. It's not just done overtly like those crazy women in those terrible outfits there with the things on their head. I mean, that's like an overt way of doing it. And it continues. It's an example of how it continues. But it's very important for us to understand the ways in which racism has put the black woman on the outside. And while racism has done that, and white women were absolutely complicit in this program of racism, because they were able to benefit from it. They benefited from it. They could have their servants. They could be the mensabs. They could sell slaves. There's all these accounts of white slave mistresses who would sell slaves to buy a new dress if they wanted a new dress. This notion that women would be more temperate and better slave owners is incorrect. They actually used this as an opportunity to benefit themselves. And in a way, white women were used. They exploited the system for themselves, but they were also used by the system as a way to say, oh, these black men are so bad, we need to now save the white woman from them. That is why we are oppressing them. I mean, in South Africa, the swart kafar is a great example of that. The fear of the black man, you know, and that leads to the formation and gives the apartheid state its sort of discourse and ideology that legitimates it. And this really feeds into the sort of liberal bourgeois feminism, these ideas. And it comes through even today in the sort of NGOization of the feminist movement, in the elitism of the feminist movement, where, for example, today someone like Hillary Clinton becomes a sort of figure of a feminist icon, when she's like agreeing to bomb people, when her family are going into Haiti and causing coups and all of those things. She all of a sudden becomes this figure. But that's because there's no consideration of the structures of race, class, imperialism, and colonialism in society. One thing that's really important is that the black radical feminist tradition has always taken into account the structure. They have always taken into account this notion and have, even understanding the role of white women in protecting the status quo, call for a universal enfranchisement, call for universal rights of everyone. And here it's really important for us. There's Sojourner Truth, this play, this speech that she gave at Akron, Ohio in 1851 at the Women's Convention. At this Women's Convention, there were women there who were saying only white women should get the vote. There were men who were saying no one should get the vote. Only the men that have it now, who are white men, should keep the vote. What is interesting about this moment is people like Frederick Douglass and so on, who don't have the vote, are there with other black radical feminists to say everyone should get the vote, including white women, black men, and black women. So there was this debate between these people, and it's here that Sojourner Truth stands up and she gives her speech, which is a very famous speech called Ain't I a Woman? And in it you will see she is talking to a very universal notion of rights and of bodies and of people and the equality that exists amongst us. And I think it's really important for us to understand this, because this is early on in the movement. And I think this is a good, I will shut up, but this is a rendition of her speech. It's done by Alfred Woodard. I don't know how to do this, I just press play.
Where there is so much racket, there must be something out of kilter. I think twixt the Negroes of the South and the women of the North, all talking about rights, the white man will be in a fix pretty soon. But what's all this here talking about? That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helped me in a carriage, or over a mud puddle, or gives me the best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted. I can work as much. No man can head me. I've gathered in the barns. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much But Jesus heard me, and ain't I a woman? When they talk about this thing, what's that thing in the head? What they call it? Intellect. That's it, honey. What that got to do with a woman's rights, a Negro's rights? If my little cup won't hold but a pint and yours hold a quart, wouldn't you be mean not to let me have my little half measure full? Then, that man there, that little man in black there, he said, women can't have rights as much as men, cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man ain't had nothing to do with it. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The men better let them.
Okay. So I think one of the things that is that while Sojourner Truth and them are asking for this more progressive, more open, more liberatory version of feminism, you have this sort of understanding of feminism that was only really kind of developed with the interest of certain people. And in this feminism, it wasn't just, which is really important, based on race, that we want white women to get the vote. It was also based on class. The suffragette movements and the early iterations of it was that only certain women should get the vote. Rich women, women who were educated, women who could read and write. Those are the sorts of women. And it was deeply divided by class. In fact, it was only until the passing of what comes to be known as the Contagious Disease Act, an act that affected all women from the Queen of England to a kitchen scullery maid, then there was a sort of move to bring women from different classes together within the suffragette movement, both in the UK and then in the United States. And I think that what we need to understand is that with this, you had this sort of, you had no version of any intersectionality within this. And this led to many black feminists claiming that without a radical restructuring of society, we couldn't be in solidarity with white feminist struggles. We couldn't be in solidarity with white women. And one key person, who's the example I'm going to use today to talk about this, is Ida B. Wells. And Ida B. Wells, she is really important for us because firstly, she's one of the earliest people who actually identifies racism within the middle class feminist movement, but she's also really important because she is undoing a lot of the stereotypes of what a black woman is. As a writer, as a journalist, as an activist, as an educated woman, as a teacher, she's really undoing that notion of empty minds and bodies. And so that is why she's incredibly important for us. And she also begins to really articulate a radical feminism against the sort of suffragette movement and the generally white sort of feminism that's happening in Europe and the United Kingdom at the time. And she begins to identify that until we don't undo this, this form of racism, and we don't undo this form of structural oppression of people in society and change the structure of society, we are not really going to have any advancements. Because, for example, in her understanding, the ways in which black men are policed, the ways in which they are oppressed, the ways in which things like lynching are used in the south of the United States to control black people and put fear into them, is vitally important to the feminist movement. It cannot be separated from each other. And so she begins with this, and she was really a very interesting woman. She was born into slavery in 1862. She was orphaned at a very young age. But before her parents could die of yellow fever, she was put into a school once they were freed from slavery. So as a very young person, she got an education. However, when her parents passed away, she became an orphan and had to take care of her siblings. So she went into work, and the work that she got was being an educator, teaching people, but at the kids. And at the same time, what she was able to do was continue her studies through various summer schools and so on. So she placed a very high premium on that. However, at the same time as doing this, she started writing for mainly black publications in the south of the United States under the pen name of Lola. And she used to write for newspapers like the Evening Star. She used to write for the Living Way. And she then became a co-owner of the Free Speech and Headlight, which was a very important newspaper. However, once she did this, and because of her views that were published in those publications, she lost her job as a teacher. The education board decided that she wasn't the right sort of teacher to have in Memphis. And so she then began to do much more work and sort of dedicated herself and her work to activism for a large period of her life. And one of the key things that she started working on and documenting was the lynchings that were happening in the South in the United States. And she writes this pamphlet called Sudden Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, and the Red Record. And she really investigates and makes this argument that in the South, they use this fear of lynching as a way to deal with black people, keep them oppressed and exploited, and have them live in fear. So she says these two things are connected to each other, and it's a way to control the entire population. And one of the ways in which she really gets into this work is when a friend of hers, their shop, their grocery store that they have built, a black man, gets burnt down by people in the South because of a variety of things, but mainly because how dare you think you can be someone who's opening a business, you can become economically independent. And for all of this, she came under huge attacks, and she faced huge sort of threats against her life, and this included the burning down eventually of her newspaper company. She then gets married. She marries Ferdinand Lee Barnett, and it was really interesting because theirs was a very unusual marriage. It was a marriage of minds and of people meeting. It was a partnership, and he had 2 kids, and she and him together had 2 kids. So it was a family of 4, and she continued a lot of her. Together, they continued a lot of their civil rights activism and work, and she continued her writing. But also very importantly, as her kids started to grow, she realized that there is a space, there's no space to educate the black child. There's no space to educate the black child in a way that makes them confident, that makes them understand the system within which they're living under. And so she begins to start her own schools to do this. And this is something you find that happens all over the world with women. When they realize that the schooling system is not up to scratch, they often do this. A lot of women do it. And it's also interesting that this task of educating and education falls on women. She continues with her anti-racist work. She's also a Georgist, which is thinking about the ways in which to change the economic structure of society, of capitalism. Georgists believe that whatever's in nature should be held in common, and what you produce you can sell. Like what you produce yourself, you could sell. But what is held in nature should be held in common. And so she has these ideas of how she thinks society should be restructured, and she does important work around that. But also very importantly, she becomes very active in the women's movement, and she creates a women's club. So in this period, in the 1880s and 1890s in the United States, as women are becoming a bit more economically empowered and have some leeway in their time and so on, they start building these clubs. And these clubs are there to foster all sorts of things, from elite women, I guess, just trying out different teas and making doilies, to working class women talking about what it is they want in their lives. So this becomes a very interesting way to organize women. and she then starts an African American Women's Club. And she also participates in the formation of, sorry, it's here on the side, the Women's Era, which is an all-black newspaper for African women. So it's run by and for African women, dealing with all their issues. And so this is what she's taken up with. And this leads her into conflict very quickly with people in the suffragette movement. And one of the key people she's in conflict with is Frances Willard, who's from the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And she was all for temperance, and she was all for no alcohol, and very Victorianized lady. And she had very patronizing ideas about black people and African people. And this is one of the things that she wrote that Ida B. Wells takes her on. And she says, the colored race multiplies like the locusts of Egypt.
Okay, Richard.
She doesn't, yeah, that's how she's from. The grog shop is its center of power. The safety of women, of childhood, of the home, is menaced in 1,000 localities at the moment, so that men dare not go beyond the sight of their own roof trees. How little we know of all this. Sealed in comfort and affluence here in the north. Right? And then she's like talking about descanting upon the right of every man to cast one ballot and have it fairly counted. That well-worn shibboleth invoked once more to dodge a living use. The fact is that illiterate colored men will not vote at all at the South until the white population chooses to have them do so, and under similar conditions they would not at the North. But every evil tends to its own cure in a republic. See what this one of Force Hill is leading in the Southerners to do. Look at Memphis with its constitutional convention. The wise measures they propose may not carry, but they have at least been recommended by the Suffragette Committee to the convention. And they provide that women in Mississippi who meet certain educational tests shall have the ballot and shall vote at polling places separate from those of men. Right? So immediately there she's basically saying, as African women, you definitely don't have the right to vote. The fact that the African family is broken in various ways, the fact that drink and violence is endemic, and then assuming at this time that women who are African have no education. And so she writes this, and Ida B. Wells takes her on. Frances Willard is interestingly going to a tour of the United Kingdom to raise funds for the Christian temperance movement. Ida B. Wells herself is in the UK at the time, and she really takes her on publicly, and it actually kind of dampens Willard's great tour of the UK and her fundraising missions. And she then has a rebuttal to Ida B. Wells. But what Ida B. Wells very, very cleverly does is she uses this way in which Frances Willard attacks her as a way, to call out the ways in which black women get silenced in society. And this was so early on. I mean, when we talk about silencing of women in society now, if you think about young women talking about it, we think it's a new thing that we are doing. We think, oh wow, we are talking about the microaggressions that are happening. But she has an amazing critique of the ways in which women are silenced. And I think we all have had experiences of this in various ways, and we all can speak to this. It's either you are irrational, it's either that you don't understand. You don't actually understand what's happening. Once you learn more, you will understand. Or that what you're asking for is impossible, this has always been the way. But then there's even more nuanced ways of silencing people. The nuanced ways of keeping people out of discourse, through language, through where you have meetings, through who can come to the meetings. All of those things are ways to keep women silenced and keep them out. If you don't have the right words to use when you are talking about women's rights, then perhaps you can't participate in the discussion. So these have always been mechanisms that were used. And this continues. I mean, in the 1960s, you have open sort of organizations for white women, like the White Women's Convention of the 1960s, where it was dealing with issues that affected white women. But, you know, I'm going back to Bell Hooks again. And she says here, we know that there could be no real sisterhood between white women and women of color if white women were not able to divest of white supremacy, if feminist movements were not fundamentally anti-racist. So in a way, the notions that Ida B. Wells is talking to in the 1890s is still issues that's been dealt with in the 1960s and 70s by black women in the United States, but also by women in places like South Africa and other parts of the world, including the United Kingdom. And I think we need to think through this, because this question, I would argue, still lies with us. And it's still an issue that we have to deal with. And in trying to deal with that, we need to think about how do we make and remake our women's movement, our feminist movement, and how do we take these theories and use them in ways that don't render us powerless? And how do we then also become aware of what it is that our own privileges in a room creates? What it is, how is it that we silence other people through our privilege and through our position in society, even as women? I mean, yesterday there was a discussion briefly about men and what do we do with men. Yes, we have to think about that, but that's not for now. I think as women, we first need to think about our own struggle. What are the terms that are going to define it? How it is that we can finally get ourselves out of this. Because in South Africa, that vibrant feminist movement that we had, that vibrant movement, even if they weren't calling themselves feminists, the ways in which women struggled in 1956 laid the groundwork for women not just to continue to struggle for women, but to become leaders and participate in the overall struggle, in the anti-apartheid struggle, as leaders, as participants, as contributors, as intellectuals of that movement. And they could do that on their own terms because they built a strong platform for themselves to do so. Obviously, there were lots of issues. I'm not saying it was perfect. But the fact of the matter is that they had this movement and they had people who were able to take up those positions within the anti-apartheid movement. How do we do that now? Part of the reason that that falls away in society is in the post-1994 moment, you have this sort of professionalization and NGOization of feminism in South Africa, where it comes out, now it becomes an instrumentalist issue. It's an issue, if there's a woman's issue, it becomes an HR issue at work, right? The HR will have to deal with it. It becomes a policy issue. I'm not saying those things aren't important. We fought for policy changes, we fought for law and rights, but in actual fact, if you have them, we have one of the most amazingly liberal constitutions in the world. It gives women so much of rights. Like yesterday we were talking about it. In South Africa, there's, of the CEOs that we have, 30% are women. Contrast to the United States where it's 8% and the UK where it's 4%, right? We have extremely advanced and progressive rights to our body, right? About our body and about abortion rights and all of these things. We need to keep those and we need to fight for those to be there because they're under attack. You know, don't think they're not. Those are under attack. We need to fight to keep those. But a lot of it means very little in the everyday struggles of ordinary women in society when they can't access those laws, when they can't make those laws work for them because they don't have money in a bourgeois, in a capitalist system to access the law. The law is there, it's fantastic, but how much does it cost to go to constitutional court and get a decent lawyer to fight for you? I mean, it's a lot of money. If you want to get senior counsel to take up a cause, I mean, has anyone seen the fees of a senior counsel? It's the most ridiculous thing in the world. I mean, it's crazy. So I think that we need to think about those questions because we have those rights. We have to keep on going and asking for them, our equal education, our right to housing, our right for us to have a safe society. We can't walk out in the streets. I mean, I remember thinking, and this is so stupid and it shows my privilege utterly, was when they said, if there were no men tomorrow on earth, what would you do? I was like, I'd go for a run.
Yeah.
Like, I'd go for a run. I'd love to run in Braamfontein. I'd love to run at night in Braamfontein. I'd love to do all, I would just go for a run. Something as basic as going for a run. You know, that's what I would do. I mean, I'm sure there's much more other things that need to be done, but just from myself, having this privilege still means there's things that I just completely, I do not even conceive of doing in my life. And I think this is what we need to think about, and we need to take these issues of racism within feminism, because it's creeped in again. It's not creeped in the way we think it has. It doesn't overtly say, oh, black women are like this. But the ways in which the NGOization and professionalization of feminism and of women's issues has happened, it means that it doesn't reach everyone, and it doesn't reach people who need to discuss it, who need to feel empowered to discuss it. Part of the task of feminism is for us to feel empowered. Our own power must come out as women. We need to be able to speak. The amount of times I've been into places where I've had to do this lecture or another similar lecture, and women come to me and say, oh, I have not spoken in 4 years at my place of work because I don't feel I can, is amazing. And this continues to happen to us. And if we had to take this purely instrumentalist and legalistic approach to issues dealing with women, to say, oh, but you have a job. You got the qualifications, we gave you the job for your qualifications. There is no discussion about the culture at work, the structure of the office, the ways in which some people's bodies are rendered less than human to other people's bodies, and so on. And I think this is where we are now, and this is what we have to take forward. So it's really important that we deal with this issue and take it on and see it for what it is and call it out, so we can build a more inclusive movement of people. Yes, we're talking about racism and the feminist movement. Doesn't mean we are not including men in this discussion or anything, so you can ask questions if you want, just not necessarily dominate the discussion. Yesterday I got some men were very scared to ask questions, so they didn't say anything. It was very nice. But no, you can definitely ask questions. And I think that this, however, is something that we really need to take on. And tomorrow, when we look at the question of class, once again, we'll see how another privilege silences women. Because ultimately what we want is for the majority of women to be liberated, to be fully equal in our society. And the only way to do that is by us understanding that that's where we have to struggle from. That's where we have to be. And in our society, that is with poor African women. And we can't do that with layers of prejudice.
I'm going to ask again. I'm sorry.
That's fine.
I think it was Titi Dagaremba a few months ago when she spoke about the statement made by Descartes about I think therefore I am.
Mm-hmm.
And the question of feminism and racism and imperialism and colonialism, what's your view in that it still centers white male, in that as a homogenous group in a way of black women, particularly focused on black African American women, we are contesting spaces whose agenda is set by this idea that I think therefore I am, which is an imperialist and colonialist idea. And in trying to contest that space, I mean, in South Africa, for example, among black women, a lot of black women, I mean, they go to churches and they wear the same clothes and they identify by their clothes. Even the political movements, they have uniforms to show that we are uniform, we are this group with one voice. What is your view in contesting along those lines instead of, well, not instead of, but as a
Counter.
well, not a counter, but maybe an option, maybe. Okay, the language is...
Yeah, alternative space.
Because, I mean, more and more it's been shown, more and more it's been shown that as humans, we are more feeling that we are mind. I mean, neuroscience shows that a lot of neurons come from the body to the brain instead from the brain to the mind. And I think this idea that women are emotional and irrational, I mean, what's your view that perhaps maybe we do not need to contest in a space whose agenda was set by the very people who are oppressing and trying to create this homogenous group of black women in different spaces? Because I think an African American black woman and a South African, in fact in South Africa we wouldn't even identify by country, maybe we would identify by ethnicity, is two different agendas.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Vashna. That was, I'm like, I've got so much going on in my head, I don't even know where to even start. So I think I'm going to start with this issue. Well, I'm going to say this issue. The rest will happen later. So one of the things, I mean, I'm obsessed with period anything, like seeing Ida B, those images you shared of Ida B. Wells in her Victorian gowns. I mean, I love that. But then there's also a part of me that's also like, be careful, because that's also very much a middle class space. Even though she may have not come from white middle class, but that in itself is still a middle. So here we have also now class happening within the black space. Because Sojourner's, what's so powerful about that performance specifically is that it's one thing done with English proper, you know, holding back and just reading, but the artist specifically chose, the actor specifically chose the twang. And that in itself is powerful, because here we have a woman from this middle class space who's not supposed to be speaking in these spaces. Those spaces would have been reserved for your black Victorians. And so now my question is in regards to that. I mean, I'm looking at your Frances, not a question, more of a comment. Frances, and she's talking about how African women must be allowed to vote because they come from they drink, they come from broken homes, black people come from broken homes, lack education, which is ironic because this is the same argument later used in, is it Nixon against the welfare queen? And it's still being used today. Watch the movie Precious, it's literally that. So, same arguments. But then I'm coming now from the space of, you know what, I'm here for the baddies, I'm here for the rebel bodies, I'm here for the witches. You say these women fit into that stereotype of colonialism, they are hypersexualized, but I don't know, I see them as something even more. But then this is my issue, right? Because now these are the stereotypes, but for me, within these stereotypes, I also see something, I see rebellious, I see taking ownership, especially taking ownership within this space, not trying to fight into those other spaces which will not deny me if I'm going to create my own spaces. You know, how do I make sense of that? Yeah.
Okay, I will come to I just want to answer these 2 points. Yeah, I think they're kind of linked actually in a way. The 2 questions, one leads from one to the other. I think with Boitmelo's question around, you know, do we create alternative spaces? Why is it that we are contesting in the very space where they create this homogeneity about other people's identities? But, you know, their identity is not homogeneous at all. It's very different. But this notion of I think, therefore I am, and the ways in which stereotypes about women being emotional gets used. So do we as women own those stereotypes? What becomes a stereotype? But do we own that part of us, the emotional part, and say, well, actually it's something good that we have? Or do we discard it and become these logical beings in the Descartesian sense? I think that, you know, this is a very, very important question, because do we then even leave those spaces and come out of it and create alternative sites of spaces where we can discuss, think through these issues and different ways of being in the world? That's effectively what we are speaking to. And those different ways of being must be seen as legitimate. Because all the time people are being different. But sometimes some differences are not seen as legitimate. They're seen as othered and not great. or bad completely. But how is it that we have these alternative space, these different ways of being, and they must be legitimate. They must have legitimacy in the world as much as Descartes did, for example, or anyone sitting at a university. I myself loved the university space because I found it a space that was so denying of anything that I was as a person, that I couldn't continue in that space anymore. So I had to leave, and I found a space in the labor movement that was more welcoming, actually, than a university space. So, you know, you try and do those things to create a space for yourself to do that important work, to really think through it. And, you know, it's very difficult, because in a world where we have been told for over 200-300 years that the space where ideas, thoughts, intellectual work comes from, and the space that is important for that, is the global north, and it resides with the white man, right? It resides in their body almost. They come to embody that they all of a sudden will have the answers, right, over us. That very particular notion is not just constraining for women. It's constraining for white women, it's constraining for black women, it's constraining for working class white men as well, who don't have that. We are all rendered in different ways not human, because we don't meet that ideal. And I do think it's about time we begin to break those down. But in doing that, not calling for a sort of return to some past that we think was amazing and glorious before the colonial imperial moment, because that's also dangerous, because we know from all of the work that's been done and accounts that we have, both written, archaeological, and so on, that people's lives weren't amazing. There wasn't this amazing moment in history for women that was so fantastic and open and liberated. There were all these other forms of oppressions and things that were happening. Rather, what we need to do, I think, is, and like you were saying, like, I mean, you liked the Victorian, the black Victorians and the outfits. That's fine to like it. What is not fine is when you think that that is the correct and only way to be a human that is respectable in society. Because that's the politics of respectability, and that's always deeply discriminatory. It's fine to like something. It's fine to think it's really nice to wear a particular outfit or a particular, but when you invest those things with a particular sense of moralistic power, that's when it becomes a problem in society, and we often tend to do that. So I think rather than that, we should be like magpies. We should be like taking whatever works for us to make this new world. Because actually, Descartes does belong to us. And we can use Descartes and read him differently, perhaps, than the white men have been for 200 years, right? Because Descartes and those ideas that come out of the Enlightenment can only happen in Europe because of the economic structure of Europe at the time. And the economic structure of Europe at the time relied on the labor of black bodies across the world to become rich. And then you have this class of people who can sit and think, I think, therefore I am, and just chill. Or be Newton and wait for an apple to fall from the tree, because someone is planting apple trees for the apple to fall on your head. Right? I mean, all of those things happen because of the labor of other people. Now, if you are doing that labor to make that thing happen, I'm sorry, those things belong to you as well. Yes. So this notion that ideas only belong to the West or belong to the global North is wrong. I hate it. Because it's actually masking, it's actually what the racists do. They tell us these ideas belong only to us and you all are inferior. Well, the only reason you all have these ideas is because of our labor. Because you stole our land, because you put us into work, enslaved us, you made us indentured workers, and you got the capital, and you could accumulate to have these ideas. That is why you had them, right? It comes from oppression. And because we gave you that capital, those ideas belong to us too. Gave you the time to have those ideas. So I think we should say, well, let us reread Descartes. As a young black woman in South Africa who's of whatever sort of identity, however intersectional you want to be, I'm going to read Descartes and I'm going to see what I can see in that that's different and new. So yes, create our alternative spaces, because we do need to come together. We do need to offer each other mentorship, comfort, solidarity, because those spaces can be so bruising, because the dominant structure of society can be so bruising to us. Let's do that. But also at the same time, don't give up the spaces that belong to us. Those universities that are all over this land, They are built by the taxes of the working class people of South Africa. So you have a right to be in those spaces. You have to claim it. We have to change that culture. Unfortunately, it's exhausting work, because when we have moments when we can make change, sometimes we retreat from it. Like I retreated myself from the university. It was too physically and mentally exhausting. And if you bring the mental issues in, then you are told, oh, you clearly this was never meant for you in the first place. You're not tough enough to handle it, right? But I can be tough enough. I mean, I was in a labor union for how many years dealing with that. That makes you very tough, but it's still welcoming. You are still seen as a human being. Whereas in these spaces, you are not. We need to reclaim that. And I think that we need to think about that tension of the politics of respectability. And Sojourner Truth is so important for us, because she's an illiterate slave woman who's able to grasp the struggles of women in society, to grasp the issues of patriarchy, and do it in a way that is still so relevant to us today. It's still so relevant to our struggles. And as Motlatsi said, the way in which she spoke, and not the Black Victorians, not the Frederick Douglasses or the Ida B. Wells types, she spoke. And that would be the same as a poor or working class woman speaking, even in a space like this, or at a university space, or at another women's convention that might happen. We need to think about those things. We need to think about how do we build a space that the Sojourner Truths of now must be able to speak at. Because we think we have the answers. It's another form of elitism and prejudice, but we don't. We might know what Deka said, or Dangaremba, or we might know our discussions around Black Victorians and things like that, but we won't also know what it's like to live in a particular condition, to be landless, to be rendered landless, and this is absolutely important. So I think, yes, I mean, I hope I'm trying to answer a question, but I think, yes, we have to create these alternative spaces, but we also have to fight and insist that all of the products of the world belong to all of us, and we have a right to them, and your reading of it might be different to mine, and we should take forward that work. We shouldn't cower from it. No. Thank you. I think there was two.
Hello, my name is Rona.
Sorry, your name is?
Rona.
Rona.
So I was hearing what you were saying about intersectionality, and especially now about like slavery, and how, you know, like working class people pay taxes, and they now, because those taxes go to universities, people are, you know, entitled to those. I'd like to just, you know, ask you something that also kind of plagued me, because I just read a book by Salma James, and it's about sex class, but also about like capitalism and Marxism in that as well. And basically she was basically saying that like women do all the work, like the housework, you know, the farming, like in Limpopo, like most of the workers there are women. They plant, they, you know. So all of that, because the black man can go work, because the black woman is there to do all the housework, so the labor is. Well, she was saying that we make products for we make the product of production, right? Like we raise children, we
social reproduction.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, like, what do you think about you know, women being paid for housework? Because it clashes with the you know, middle class notion of, oh no, we should all go to work, you know, and get that money. But it's like, we now don't recognize the work. That's what is work then? Is it only work when it's recognized by capitalism? So yeah, that's my question to all of us. Yeah, like, what do we do? Do we go? Because now some people are like, no, now we're boxing people, women back into the kitchen because that's their place. But you know, so, yeah.
Okay.
So I think My
Name?
Jonathan. So I think my comment is a bit related to her comment. It's based on separatism in feminism, or isolationist feminism. I've actually been able to study the history of the United States, and I've read quite a few publications like Sojourner Truth's Life Story, yes, and that publication, And I, a Woman, the one that we just watched now. And obviously her narrative seems to be very isolationist, since she's African American and different from other feminists that were there at the time, like Amelia Bloomer and Susan B. Anthony. When they had their Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, African American women were never really given an opportunity to actually express their viewpoints on feminism. And that narrative just carried on throughout the decades and the centuries, the decades of the 19th and 20th centuries. Of course, Ida B. Wells also came in as well with her anti-lynching approach. But still, there were those differences. There was that separatism between African American women and the white American women. And even though the 20th Amendment to the US Constitution was validated because of the suffrage movement in 1919, 1920, it still felt like African American women were marginalized. And it still feels the same today, that feminism is still, it's separatist. You've got two classes, the privileged white feminists as well as the disadvantaged feminists from other racial backgrounds. And it's getting back to what you just said about some feminists actually doing the menial jobs, cleaning homes and the like of it. Whilst
I don't think it's a menial job to clean a house.
Okay, right, yeah.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thank you.
But yeah, those variances, do you think there will ever come a time when feminism can actually, or feminists can actually be able to work together from different classes, different races, different backgrounds, and just have a united approach and front?
Do you think there'll ever be a time when Marxists can work together and communists? Do you think there'll ever be a time when the leftists in the country can work together? Do you think there'll ever be a time when the liberals in the country can work together? The only people that seem to get really quickly working together are conservative right-wing people. No, I mean, I think I'll start with yours first because it's a bit shorter and quicker, because the first question that was asked is my favorite question ever. So it deals with all the things I love. But no, so I think that what you're saying is, it's not separatism and isolation, it's what you find. You find these divisions. And the divisions in movements are the divisions that is a reflection of what society looks like. If a society is racist, if a society is based on class discrimination, those things show themselves in a movement, right? Even in our labor movement, you have those hierarchies. Even in the left movements, even in South Africa, you have those hierarchies. Some racial groups who are classified as black, like Indian or colored people, might think they're more superior, even in the left, because of their historical condition, for example, and that a working class black person is not as advanced intellectually or theoretically as an Indian professor from Wits University, for example. So I think that happens a lot. It happens in all movements. But once again, when people are calling for a more advanced idea, as Sojourner Truth did, a more universalist way, that has to be supported. And it often is not supported because no one wants the status quo to change, because they're benefiting from it. White men wouldn't want it to change. Men in general wouldn't want it to change. White women won't want it to change if they are benefiting. If you take the United States, and you know, it happens with people later on, but it also happens with Angela Davis and Bell Hooks and them. They are raising these same questions around this. But there were moments when people organized. I mean, the 1956 past campaign that happened in South Africa, that was a moment when all women of different races, class groups, organized themselves. in a mass campaign to repeal past laws in South Africa. So it can be done. I mean, we know that people can come together, like for example in the UDF. So in the same way, it can be done. It just requires a deep organization, the deep organizing of society, and to understand where people are. For example, in 1956, you had the Gatherings Act. So it was impossible to have something like this. So people would have to mobilize by speaking to individuals. More than 2 people couldn't gather at the same time. So those techniques, you need to understand that if you are in South Africa and you're truly committed to creating an equal society and undoing patriarchy, because in feminism, and the feminism that I would think I would want to be part of is one that is about creating an equal society. It's not patriarchy, it's not creating another patriarchy with women in charge. Because patriarchy is about hierarchy. That's why it fits so well to capital, because it's about creating a divided society. What we want is a society that's equal. And in doing that, there will be no hierarchy. So we understand that society is full of hierarchy. When we build our organizations, we should strive to undo hierarchy in those organizations. We should strive to undo divisions. It's very difficult, but in building that, in doing it every day through practice of organizing, it will come and it will happen. And the 1956 moment for us is really important because it gives us a sort of template by which it should be done. And one of the key things we need to do is we need to start thinking about what is the issue that affects most women in society. Yes, we all have our own issues. Like I want to go for a run at night in Braamfontein. It's a very small issue, right? But there are major issues that are affecting women in society. And then what are those? What are affecting the majority of women in society? And let's build on those issues as a unifying thing. And if you're a middle class woman, a rich white woman, if you're a domestic worker, if you're a nun, come and put yourself in service of that task. That's how we'll be united to create something. I think that's the way to do it. In terms of Salma James and capitalism and Marxism, it's really important. You're kind of preempting tomorrow's discussion, which is going to be precisely on this, on the question of class and the question of the way, but I'll go into a bit of it now because some of you might not be here tomorrow, but it's really important that what Salma James and Marxist feminists in general are talking about is the way in which all the labor that women do in society has not been recognized as labor. Because if you're at home and working, if you're taking care of the children, if you're cleaning the house, you're doing all these things that make society function. Because just say, if men all went to work, working class, white men, African men, everyone, wherever the men who have to go to work, if they went to work and women did nothing, if they held their labor, right, while they were at home, if they didn't do the housework, if they didn't cook, if they didn't clean, if they didn't do all of those things, men would come home to a house that was not functioning, right? And that would not make capital function. They won't become efficient laborers for capital. So it suits capital to have this notion of housewife. And capital uses all sorts of things. It uses religion, it uses culture. Oh, it's our culture that you must stay at home. Oh, it's our religion that women can't work. All that nonsense, right? So that's what happens. But it's only done because work of women is not seen as labor. And they purposely do that so they don't have to pay you for that labor. So people like Salma James and Sylvia Federici and them, they developed the wages for housewife movement, which is fundamentally important. It's exceptionally important because what white feminism tends to do, this middle class white feminism, in the 70s, 80s, coming out of universities, they start asking for this right to work. That becomes a key thing, like to go out and work. And Bell Hooks puts it beautifully. I don't have the quote on me now, but she says that the reason why these white women are asking for this is because they never had to work. African women have had to work all the time. Slavery, domestic work, all the time you are working. In fact, if they had taken African women into account, they would have found that their demands would have been more leave days, higher wages, not the right to work. They don't need the right, they've always had to work. There's no right that they're demanding. The privilege of white women was that they could demand the right to work because they did not work. And now that becomes seen as a progressive stance. That's not a progressive stance. That's just doing something that you've been denied the ability to do because of your privilege and your gender and discrimination, but it's not what the whole of society needs or wants. And so this notion of this demand for social reproduction, that's the term Marxist feminists use. The reproduction of society. What you are producing is, you're not producing a car on the factory floor line, you are reproducing society, making sure kids can go to school, that they get born, that they stay alive when they are born, that they get fed, that they get clothed. You are doing all this work and capital gets it for free. And the only people benefiting from this is capitalism. And the rest of you, and then the man on behalf of capital will go home and discipline his wife for saying you are being a bad housewife, I'm the man. Actually, you're not the man. Actually, all you are is another like cog in the machinery of capitalism. You are also exploited and oppressed, but you get paid a little bit of your surplus labor value, whereas women get nothing, right, if you are in the home. So they ask for this, and it's actually an incredibly a really good practical way to make a difference in women's lives. And what you find happening is this becomes something that is used by people like Hugo Chavez later on when he comes to power in Venezuela to give women grants. Lula does this as well. These grants allow you to have some economic freedom. But beyond that, what they start doing, like when Fidel Castro and them came to power in Cuba, what they did was they said, okay, well, we can't change society, like the social structure of society immediately, because there's patriarchy, it's entrenched through all these things. What we're going to do is make the housewife's life a bit easier. We're going to make sure there's washing machines installed. Immediately that frees up hours of your day to do something else, to express yourself in other ways. You have time. So there's material changes you can do to women's lives in the now that can make a difference to them and alleviate some of the repression and oppression that they experience. But I'll talk much more about it tomorrow. But it's an incredibly important thing, because that's another thing that affects us, is this class division and the ways in which capital divides society and divides movements like feminism and any other liberatory politics gets divided. I think the reason why the right is not divided is because they are so firm in their belief that capitalism is great and them being in charge is great and having this is great, that they can unite. But what they are able to do is anyone that challenges them, they are able to sow divisions through a variety of factors that divide us in society already, and that gets reflected in those movements. And that's what we have to overcome, and we have to work to overcome. Thank you. Okay, comrades. Okay, is there one more? I think
two more.
Wait.
There's two more.
Okay, there's two more. Okay.
All right. Good evening. My name is Ayanda, and I just want to say that, listen, I'm not homophobic or anything. I just hope that we can just unpack this in the most honest way ever. First of all, this has been something that has been provoking me. Because I know like transgender is like a thing now that's in the society and people are aware of it, and I think when it's pioneered by men who are white in especially the global south, who have the financing to transition their bodies and their genitalities, and I'm so sorry. And I feel like a lot of women issues are being pushed aside because we are trying to accept these men into the society who are just simply insecure about their bodies or whatsoever. And I just, yeah, it's something that just puzzles me, yeah.
Okay. That's a very big question for closing. That's cool. And then, okay, this is the last question, then we're closing.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi, okay, you can hear me. So I have two kind of questions. So one is, how do you think we're able to take, kind of the social knowledge at the moment regarding women, with regards to us needing to be more so in the household and as the carers and birthers and all of these conversations, how do we take that out, like the social reproduction aspect? How do we respect that, but at the same time allow kind of take it out of our social imagination that we're now removing that idea that women can actually be outside of that. How do we do that within our society, especially considering the context of such a patriarchal society within South Africa, with all of our cultures, they all seem to be so patriarchal. And how do we now deal with that in an intersectional way? Do you think that's possible? And another question is, do you think feminism is still relevant and possible to be saved? Any of the ones mentioned on the screen nowadays, when I know, like when I grew up, I'd be like, yeah, feminism, and that is my intersectional feminism, and obviously as like a white woman, I've had to learn about all of these things, and then, but then at the same time, so many people are still like, so, dismissive, but also they don't believe in feminism anymore. They think it does not benefit them anymore, and that it's so outdated.
You mean
as you
women?
said, yeah, women, yeah, it's so outdated, and it's so, as you said, based in like a racist society and from racist perspectives, and never intended to be inclusive of any other gender, any other race, any other like class. Like how do we either embrace feminism in the 21st century, 2023, or how do we remove it and find something new? Those are my two questions.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay, all big questions. I think I will start with the issue around transgender. I think I understand that there is a lot of conflict that's arising within feminism and within the women's movement around this question and this issue. But I think that this idea that it's something that's been like pushed by white men with privilege is not exactly a correct line. I mean, if you had to take the ways in which pre-colonial culture existed in terms of gender and gender fluidity, you find there's lots of examples of that. For example, in India, there's what you call the hijras, which are men who become women fully in society, and they live like that their whole lives. And now that they actually have the ability to have their bodies changed, are doing so as well. Right? And that is something that predates any white person, any colonialism or anything like that. There was this desire. And I think that as human beings and as people who want to make an alternative sort of society, like not the ones that we are saying those white men who read Descartes and then impose it onto us are trying to build that's supposed to be heartless and technical and cruel. We should accept it. Doesn't mean that there aren't going to be people who use this as a way to deal with some issue that might not necessarily be a true gender identity issue as another means of domination. But that's not a transgender issue. That's that person's issue. That person and that individual or those individuals are the issue. Just as how there are many women in the women's movement who use the discourse of feminism to rise by themselves and oppress other women. Now that doesn't mean feminism is the problem or women are the problem, so we must remove women from feminism. It means that those women who do that are a problem. Margaret Thatcher is a problem to women. She was a massive problem to women. She was worse than the worst patriarchist. She closed down all of the social stuff that was in place to help women, to help the most dispossessed women. She basically hated women. Right? And she didn't see any value in them besides her own self and who she was. So now what? We must hate all women and say that therefore we shouldn't have them in the feminist movement. No, I don't think so. I think we should say she's a problem. Right? I mean, if a man has to now dress up as a woman to go and attack a woman in a toilet or something like that, then that's that man's problem. That's a patriarchal solution. That's what he's doing, right? To be oppressive in society. That is not a transgender problem. So I think we should be more open because we are trying to be open and create a society. Feminism is not about, yes, it is about dealing with women's issues, but it's dealing with people who are vulnerable. Lots of people are vulnerable in society. That is why people like Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Bell Hooks, and them understood that the question is not simply about women and a gender question. It's about race, class, gender in all its varieties, about the social structure of society that needs to change. We need to create a space where this is open. In fact, we should be saying that this right to gender change should not be limited to people with money. It should be something that is done for people who want it to be done, who have taken this decision after consideration and whatever. That's what we should be doing. It should be done in a healthy way and so on. So I definitely think that and if we find people who are using, who are in the feminist movement or in a women's movement or whatever organization you have, who are using this gender change to be able to dominate, then they must be dealt with for the issues of domination. But it shouldn't be something that becomes, therefore all transgender people, this is an issue. I think that's how we can deal with that much more. In terms of how do we take the social knowledge, how do we say women can be outside the house as well? There's been lots of times a few times it has been done. In Soviet Russia, for example, what happened was this understanding that society takes much longer, right? If you read, so as a socialist and a communist, what that theory does is it says society might change, right? You might change the state, but society itself lags behind. There's still remnants of the way in which we did things before that stay with us. And we see this all too well, right? In South Africa, apartheid is over, but racism is not over, right? It's how we did things that stay with us. In that moment, when we are trying to change the world, in that moment, this is where the stage thing, Matlatsi, becomes very important. In that stage, when we're bringing that change, that transitional phase, we will need to still have laws and things that deal with that. So we can change it. And then they say you get into a communist society when those things are changed and you don't have those hierarchies and those problems anymore. So in the same way, I think around this feminist issue, around women's labor, around reproductive labor in the home, we don't say women should not be in the home, or we don't say all women should go to work. What we say rather is this should be paid for because it's a job, right? And it's contributing to society, and it's contributing to society, and you should get paid. Alternatively, what they did, for example, in Russia, when most women went to work, after the communist revolution, they would create in apartments, they would remove the kitchens. Because they knew that even though women are going to work, what happens when women come home from work? Do you sit and relax with the beer? No, there's no sitting and relaxing with the beer, right? You have to immediately start cooking, right? You have to immediately start doing house. You have to immediately check what the homework is for the kids for the next day. You have to do all these things, right? And when you are doing all these things, it's now become mental labor as well. Even if you've gone away, you're still thinking, oh, this needs to be done, right? So they understood this will be the case. So they said, well, just remove the kitchen. And in all these apartments, there were no kitchens. They had a canteen, and people were employed to cook meals. And so everyone ate there. So women went to work and they came home and they didn't have to cook. It was a mechanism that was put in place to begin the reform, to begin that change. So we can't always get what we want, but we can do things, and it has been done before. And this thing about, do I think feminism is relevant today? Well, I hope so. I mean, otherwise I'm completely irrelevant as a human being. I'm a historian and a feminist. I mean, I have no relevance at all at this point. No, I think it's absolutely relevant. I think it is under attack. And I think it's really under attack. Any form of advancement, of liberation for people who are oppressed is under attack in the world today. There's a huge rise in fascism. There's a huge rise in right-wing politics. And we have to take this on. And it's not necessarily done. And we must remember, even when Hitler and them were doing it, it wasn't like we think about it because when we think about concentration camps and the horrors, it was done very attractively at first, with beautiful propaganda and all those things. And yesterday I spoke about this, the broadcasts, these idiots, Joe Rogan and all these people, and that Tate guy. They are people who are, because masculinity itself is in crisis, because of the condition of the world, they are now turning on women, because there's an opening up in society. On one hand, there's this massive opening up in society about ideas, different ways of being in the world, contestations of identities. There's that happening. And at the same time, people are feeling more and more vulnerable. Economically, people are feeling vulnerable all over the world, right? In terms of their space, their space in society. And when this kind of change happens, there's always a backlash. And that's happening a lot. And what ends up happening is a lot of women, and I can tell you this, a lot of women who are middle class feel like, oh, well, feminism does nothing for me. Or they say, oh, they don't want to say they're feminist. Or sometimes it affects their dating life, or we wouldn't say it in the workplace or something, right? Because you'd be seen as too much, right? So you'll disregard it and you think it's useless. But in actual fact, if you looked at the ways in which working class and poor women organize themselves in society, they rely on women all the time. Just if you think about women who are domestic workers can be domestic workers in people's house because their kids are being raised somewhere else by grandmothers and aunts and aunties, right? In rural areas. That's relying on women. It's women who are doing that labor for each other and creating those alliances. They're not calling it feminism. They're not calling that support and solidarity feminism. But it is acts of caring for each other as women. It's ways to make our lives easier for each other. So I think that's what we need to think about. It's very easy when you have some privilege to say, oh, well, I'm okay now. What? Well, if you're okay, that's great. But do you not think that you should be fighting for a society where everyone is okay? You know, I mean, I don't have abusive men in my life. I have lovely, supportive men in my life who are fantastic and amazing. But I don't think that the struggle then ends because I have privilege and I have all of these things. It still needs to continue. And I think we need to take it up. And we need to do this. It came up yesterday, and it's vitally important we do this cultural work of once again making it important, about having the debates about different types of gender, about thinking about how we can bring ourselves all together in this journey, because that's fundamentally where we are. And we don't have to stick to labels. We don't have to say, oh yes, I'm the feminist, most feminist in the world, and spout all the feminist theory. I mean, you know, so what? But so what, actually, at the end of the day? I mean, Judith Butler is the biggest feminist who can tell you the biggest theory of feminism, but has not really affected change in everyday lives of women, right? So what it is that we need to do, and I think we should really start beginning to think about that, and all of us should emerge this week, renewed with the spirit to do something, like the woman in 1956 who did it under apartheid. We have all this freedom, and all of y'all should be forming sister castes. And you all should all be like challenging these Andrew Tates and Joe Rogans who have half a brain and are so insecure. You all should be doing that work and changing this. And we should be thinking about how to revive this and make it popular again. But I think it's under attack, and I think often false discourses are used where, and that's very dominant right now in society. We shouldn't think it's not. So yeah, but before the dark, what's darkest before the light, right? So we should think of it in that way. Okay, thank you all so much.